All right, ladies and gentlemen, we got carried away with the conversation up here up front. You know, when people ask questions about Tanakh, we whip out our books and we start studying. So you don't realize this, but we started our own little private individual study session right here. And so I'm going to, we're allowed, you're allowed, but I know you enjoy the time talking together. So unfortunately, those people who are trying to join us online, they have no idea what's going on because we're late starting. We took too long of a break, so I'm going to blame that one on Eliana and Michael Ruskin because they came up and asked me questions. So there you go. That's how it happens. All right, fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk a little bit about unity in diversity. We took a dive into the book of Romans together, and hopefully that's been a productive dive for you. I called this teaching Good News for Jews, Greeks, and Barbarians. It's kind of an unusual title, but if you understand what the book of Romans is all about, it's about Shaul writing a letter to the congregations in Rome, to all the different groups of worshipers who have aligned themselves to Israel but somehow misunderstand who Jews are and what their role is and how they fit into this story. And so there's a lot of disunity between Roman followers of Messiah and Jews who are actually living in Rome. And so upon that context, Shaul is writing his letter, and he's trying to build unity among believers. And so he continues to speak to them. Sometimes he speaks to the Romans, sometimes he speaks to Jews, sometimes he speaks to them collectively, but his goal is to bring them together. And what he wants them to understand is they're united in this, a powerful message, the message of good news. So last time we stopped at the verses, and I'm going to pick up exactly where we stopped. So this is where our conversation got really interesting. And people have been jumping in with all kinds of thoughts and ideas. We read Romans chapter 4, verse 25. And right there is where our conversation really took off. So it says, this is what Paul is writing. So he says, he who was delivered over because of our wrongdoings. Okay, so these are our wrongdoings. And was raised because of our justification. So we talked about the idea that Shaul is presenting Messiah who was delivered over, and of course he was delivered over to the sinful people, right? He was given over to the Romans to be killed. And so he's given over to them. But it wasn't just that he was just handed over to be killed. It says, because of our wrongdoings. So according to Shaul, it is our wrongdoings, our paraptomata, well, it says in Greek right there, is what has brought this upon him. That's why he was willing to be delivered over. And then it says he didn't just die. It says he was raised because of our justification. So the idea of justification, so this is the word dikaiosune, righteousness we talked about, tzedek, right? Being justified, being made righteous. So because we needed to be made righteous, he was raised from the dead. So essentially, the resurrection of Yeshua is a moment that brings us something amazing, justification. Hopefully that makes sense. So this is kind of where we stopped. This is what launched our conversation. And if you remember, I brought in other verses from the book of Acts. This is where Shaul is speaking to a different audience. He's speaking in the synagogue, and you can look that up. It's in Acts 13. He is traveling in Syria, and on Shabbat, he speaks in the synagogue. He gives a very, very long message, just like our times together. You know, they would sit down and discuss the scrolls, and they would talk about it, and everyone in the community would gather around, and they say, okay, we have a guest speaker from out of town traveling, Shaul. He's going to tell us what God has put upon his heart, and he tells them this long story about Yeshua, and in the middle of that story, he explains to them what he understands actually happened, and this is what we call the Besorah. This is what we call the good news, the gospel. And so this is what he writes in Acts 13. But remember, this is a very Jewish crowd. This is a synagogue. It's very different from the book of Romans. So the language that he might use is a little bit different. He says, therefore, let it be known to you, brothers, that through him, meaning the Messiah, forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. And I had to retranslate this verse, by the way. Remember last time I read this for you. I read it to you directly out of NASB, New American Standard Bible, which I told you kind of mistranslated it a little bit. So let's keep following. Forgiveness of sins which is proclaimed to you. So because of it's through him. So Messiah brings forgiveness of sins. Forgiveness of sins is something very specific. Remember, this is that Greek word aphesis. It means letting go, essentially. Forgiveness is just that. It's a pardon, right? So there's a pardon. The language of the pardon is very typical. Not just the language of sacrifice, but specifically the language of forgiveness and pardon is a good language that comes up in connection to Messiah. So he says that through him is forgiveness of sins proclaimed to you in all matters through which the law of Moses was not able to justify. Remember, the original translation, it would say, in which you were freed, in which the law of Moses could not free you from. And so, and that's a very, very bad translation, because the word, once again, is justification. Okay, the word is to justify, dikaiosune, righteousness. That's that idea, being made righteous. It has nothing to do with being freed from something. It's being made righteous. So it says, in all matters for which the law of Moses was not able to justify. That's what Messiah is about. That's what his forgiveness is about. There are things that the law of Moses can bring justification to you, but there are some things that the law of Moses does not cover. There are some sins, essentially, that there is no method of rectifying them through the Torah. You just have to follow the mercy of God. So that's what he says Messiah is doing. So through him, meaning through Messiah, everyone who believes is made righteous. So he's just telling you that he is the agent of forgiveness, which is how he described this gospel. He said there's a righteousness of God which is outside of the Torah. It's in the Torah. Torah speaks about it, but it's not part of the law of Moses. It is outside of that. Messiah is clearly outside of that. Therefore, see that the thing spoken of the prophets does not come upon you. Well, you know what has spoken of the prophets. Most of the time, prophets speak of judgment, right? Sometimes we get the verses of hope, like the ones that we've been reading in these past weeks of consolation. But a lot of times the prophets speak some very harsh words. The message of the prophet usually is this: repent, for you have walked away from God, right? Or else. And that else is usually quite elaborate of the kind of things that God may do to us if we continue to be disobedient. And that's supposed to bring us back. That's the idea. So we don't want that to happen to us. So what should we do? Well, according to Shaul in the book of Acts, as he speaks in the synagogue, he says it is through Messiah that this forgiveness of sins is proclaimed. There's that availability of forgiveness. The law of Moses brings us a lot of remedies, a lot of ways to justify ourselves, a lot of ways to become right with God. All the sacrifices, all the offerings, all the things that are given in the Torah actually lead us towards that correction of relationship, the breakdown that's happened. But there are some things that the Torah leaves uncovered, essentially, and we have to have that forgiveness that just comes directly from God. It's not something we can do to guarantee that forgiveness. Remember the sin of David? David saw a beautiful woman bathing on top of her house. I know it's a strange place to take a bath, but that's the way they did it back then. People's roofs were extensions of their houses. Think of them as decks. People treated the roofs of their houses the same way we do decks today. So she was taking a bath on top of her house, and David's palace was taller than her house. So he looked down and saw a beautiful woman, and next thing you know, he's asking for his servants to bring her to him. And out of that comes a terrible sin and a great tragedy for the house of David, and the suffering that he lives in his life because he sins against God in this way. And then David writes a beautiful psalm in which he confesses that sin and begs God for forgiveness. And he says, God, if there was a sacrifice that I could bring, I would bring it. If there was something I could do to make things right, I would do this. But there is nothing that I can offer you for forgiveness of the sin. So he says, I just fall in your mercy and I beg. And that's what David does in the book of Psalms. He pleads with God and he begs for that. Why? Because there are some sins in Torah that are not covered by any sorts of rectification, any sort of a sacrifice that there could be. So this is what Shaul is talking about. And this is kind of how I brought in the verse from Acts to help you connect with a much shorter and a simpler message in the book of Romans. That basically He's delivered over because of our wrongdoing. So when he says that Messiah is delivered over because of our wrongdoings, this is what he means. And he's raised because of our justification. So the resurrection of Messiah brings about justification to us. Why? Because symbolically we're connected to the Messiah. We die with him, we're raised with him. The unity with Messiah, when we recite those verses and we say that, abide with me, abide in me, I'm the vine, you are the branches, this is what we're doing. It's saying we're binding ourselves to Messiah. His destiny is our destiny. His life is our life. And so Shaul is going to talk about this. Actually, the whole that whole entire section of the book of Romans, he's going to talk about our connection and our fusing of ourselves with Messiah in such a way. So this is chapter 5. We got to the beginning of chapter 5 now. So that was the end of chapter 4. We made it into 5. And it begins it with the word therefore. So in Paul's writings, you know this very easy. This is when he gets to the therefore. When he gets to the therefore, he's making a conclusion upon everything that he said prior to that. So you have to back up however far you have to back up to follow his logic, but we get the nice therefore. Therefore, having been justified by faith or belief or faithfulness, whatever that word means, remember I told you it means multiple things in Greek, we have peace with God through our Master Yeshua the Messiah. So we have peace because we have been justified, meaning we have been made righteous. We stand with God without having to have blame. But it's done through faith or belief or faithfulness, whatever that means. We're not quite sure. We still have to understand what Shaul is saying. But we have peace because of Yeshua. So that means that there probably wasn't peace before. So he continues, through whom we also have obtained our access by faith, or by belief, or by faithfulness, into this grace in which we stand, and we celebrate in hope of the glory of God. So peace with God is usually been expressed on the altar via a very special sacrifice. Maybe if you remember reading the book of Leviticus about a special offering called shalomim, the well-being offering, or sometimes it is translated as peace offering. Peace is one of the terms, one of the words, when everything is well, when everything is good. It's an offering when you share a meal in God's presence, you share a meal with God. You bring an offering, not because you've done anything wrong. You bring an offering not because you messed up and now you have to correct for your sin. And there are a lot of atoning offerings where people are guilty before God, so they bring a guilt offering. They bring a sin offering. They bring a purification offering. Shalomim has nothing to do with that. Shalomim you bring mainly because everything is good with you and God. There are no problems. So you celebrate. It's a celebration offering. Everything is smooth, is good, it's well, nothing is wrong. And you bring an offering to God, and portion of it goes to God. It gets burned up with fire. Portion of it goes to the priest, and portion of it comes back to you as the worshiper, and you actually eat it in God's presence. The meat is roasted and it's eaten. It's holy, it's special. You can't leave the precinct of the temple in Jerusalem. You have to eat it right there, but you eat it. It's a meal with God. That's a peace offering. That's what we're talking about. That whenever you see in the Torah, that's how it's explained. Now, when Shaul is talking about having peace with God, maybe that's what's on his mind. And for those who believe in Yeshua, apparently this transaction, this moment, it provides access to the divine grace or favor. The word grace has been used, misused, and abused in every way possible. I've come to the point where I can't stand that word anymore in English because of the words and the commentaries that have just, I don't know, the only word that comes to them is just, they just abused it to such a degree. It's made to mean something it was never meant to mean. So I prefer to use the word favor. That's my stand-in word for grace. So every time I say favor, that's what I mean. So the Hebrew word is chen. Chen means something that you do not earn. It's just It's like a liking. So in Hebrew people say matzah chen beinayim, meaning it looks good to my eyes, meaning I like you. You know how you say it's something, you like somebody in Hebrew, you say you find favor in my eyes. That's how you say it in Hebrew. You can't say I like you. You say you find favor in my eyes, or that finds favor in my eyes. Literally, that's how you say it in Hebrew. So the word hen, favor, grace, liking, that's what it means. So we're finding that. We're finding grace. We're finding God's favor through all of this that Yeshua is doing. And all of that is done by faith. All of that is done by faithfulness. All of that is done through belief. It's not through something we do. It's something that God does. But we just find it. We just get lucky. We just stumble upon it. It's a gift, Shaul told us. That's what the gift is. Something you didn't earn or work for. It's not something that you say, you owe this to me. I give you that. You give me that. No, that's not a gift. That's called a payment. Guess what? Most of the times the sacrifices are brought, that's how they are. God, you give me cleansing because I bring the sacrifice. It's a kofar, it's a ransom, it's a payment. But that's not how it is with chen. With chen, it's a gift. It's a favor. I give it to you because you find favor in my eyes. That's it. This is what Shaul is talking about. Finding forgiveness through what Yeshua has done. And it's done by faith. Now he's trying to explain this to a bunch of ex-pagans in Rome who don't quite understand the scriptures. How much they know the scriptures, I don't know. I do not know how much school time they have done to read or to study or to understand how much schooling they had to appropriate this spiritual information. I really don't know. So I'm only guessing of how much they don't know or do not know. But I'm pretty certain that, when he writes that to Romans, how much of that settles in, I don't know. I know it makes sense to Jews when he uses language like that, because these are the words very familiar to us. Again, he's tapping into information which we know. So hopefully that makes sense. Therefore part, this is the punchline to the things that he's been teaching and explaining in the previous chapter. We've been reading chapter 4. And hopefully it makes sense, because this is his explanation of where we stand, he says. We've obtained access and we stand in grace. So standing in grace or standing in favor is a position. It's like you find a spot and you mark it on a spot on the floor. Or I don't know, if you ever played in a theater, they would mark things on the floor and they would give you a roll and they give you your lines and they'll say, this is your spot where you stand. And it's very difficult when you walk out on the stage and all these people out there, you have no idea where to do it. So they actually mark a little spot on the floor that the audience can't see, obviously, from far away. But they're like, this is your spot. This is where you stand. So with anything where there's performance, a lot of times they do that. This is the grace in which we stand. So as long as we stand in that spot, we get that spotlight of grace upon us, God's favor. And all of a sudden, we are benefiting from something which we actually didn't do anything for. It's a gift.
I think a lot of us who have come from churches where the gospel is mostly preached as an individual endeavor, that in Paul likening this, he's speaking to pagans, they don't know about Shalomim offering, but they are coming out of a communal idea of the God that we serve, because this is where we live, or this is our city, that we should more see in this and then emphasize in our own thinking about our salvation through Messiah, how communal it is. Yeah. As we come up to the high holidays, that just, we're all in this together. We stand in this together, and we celebrate together. It's not just our little personal journey.
Exactly. And we realize that in the end, without each other, we don't really have a future, do we? So yes, there's a lot of communal aspect in Judaism, which frankly is quite often absent in different forms of Christianity. It is very individualistic, I realize that.
And these pagans would need that, because they're leaving something that's very sure to them, their identity.
Right.
And if they're just coming into it alone, they got nothing.
Yeah, it's a difficult place, which is why Shaul writes these letters. So the entire New Testament was written for that reason alone, is to give assurances to people who really don't know where they stand with God. It's very difficult for people to walk into this Jewish teaching and all of a sudden know, how do you fit in? Where do you belong? So Shaul, he calls on Jews and Romans both to celebrate this great news. He actually tells them, we should celebrate this. This is amazing. This is a gift. This is a benefit that you have received. God's favor. So, and then he continues, it's not only this, but we also celebrate in our tribulations. Well, that's not so celebratory. We don't want to celebrate our tribulations, but he says so. Knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance, and perseverance proving character, and proving character hope, and hope does not disappoint because the love of God has been poured out within our hearts, the Holy Spirit who was given to us. Well, he talks about tribulation and perseverance and character. He has been talking about Abraham, and he will continue talking about Abraham. Abraham has received promises. Here's this 90-year-old man. I'm going to give you a family. You're going to be a father. And then he waits and waits and waits, and he's pushing 100, and he still doesn't have any children. Talk about perseverance. Talk about faith. Talk about trust. Talk about tribulation. And meanwhile, you're going to have to fight this war, and your nephew is going to be kidnapped by some foreign kings, whom you're going to have to get an army and go get away from this. Like, all this stuff happens in the life of Abraham. He's tested. He's tried. He goes through tribulations and trials. This is what he's talking about. In the end, our perseverance through difficult moments actually brings about character. And then he talks about hope and future and things like that. And he says that's part of what we should be celebrating or looking forward to, because tribulations is a part of it. Now, for Romans, this should strike home very close, because if they are to align themselves with Israel, they are going to be experiencing some persecutions and tribulations from their own people, because they will be a definitely outnumbered minority who would align themselves with Jews who, by the way, are enemies of the state, because those Jews just keep starting rebellions against Rome. They just will not be governed. They just one revolution, another revolution, another revolution. And all these uprisings, and the relationship between Jews and Romans is a strained one. And if you are a Roman and you want to be associated and related to these Jews, well, that's a difficult place to be, because you are doing something not very culturally expedient, which makes sense of why some people would want to distance themselves from Israel. Yes, Dave?
So, like you said, everything is looking forward, and that hope for the future, is what fuels our faith for today. So we can endure through these hardships, and we can smile in the face of oppression and hardship and things of that nature. And Abraham, and so it reminds me of Hebrews 11, which is the chapter of faith, and goes through all the forefathers and patriarchs and predecessors and martyrs and prophets and everybody that at the end it ends with, these all having been commended for their faith didn't receive the promise, God having provided some better thing concerning us, so that apart from us they should not be made perfect. And I also think apart from them, it's not going to happen. And even Messiah in the next, that for the joy set before him endured the cross. There's
right.
a future hope that fuels our faith and discipleship for today. And right. I just think there's so much power in that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeshua himself, he goes to die because he knows that, well, he trusts God that he will be raised from the dead, and he trusts God that he will be vindicated, and he trusts God that in the end times he will be given an ability to rule and to judge. And these are the kinds of things that are, again, promised by the prophets. That's what the prophets said Messiah will do. So he believes that that's what's going to happen, and he's willing to go through suffering and tribulation because of that. It's worth it. Why? Because you know what's coming. The big picture, the big idea of how we're connected to this story. So I'm hoping that Shaul's writings, speak to you as well, not just to Romans. I mean, they were written to them, but I think they can speak to us on a different level as well. So let's keep moving forward. Romans 5, verses 6 through 9. So for while we were still hopeless, at the right time, Messiah died for the ungodly. Now, who do you think he's writing to right here? Who's ungodly? Romans. While we were still helpless, at the right time. At the right time is important. There's a lot in that statement. I'm not sure I can unpack it today, but had to happen the way it had to happen at the right time. For one will hardly die for a righteous person, and this is just Shaul's logic, by the way, if you haven't figured this out. One would hardly die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love towards us in that while we were still sinners, Messiah died for us. Again, that us language, we don't always know what that us means. Maybe Shaul is just speaking to Romans and he's including himself into that category. Why? Because, well, Messiah died for him as well. So he says that God loved us and we were not on the right page with him. Yet Messiah died for us. And that's an act of redemption. That's an act of mercy. That's an act of grace. That's what he's saying. This is favor that's coming our way. Much more than having now been justified, being made righteous by his blood. Okay? Why? Because he died. Blood is an idiom for life. We shall be saved or rescued from the wrath of God through him. So, of course, the question I have to ask you is, what are we saved, rescued from? It tells you right there in the end of the verse. What are we saved from? Judgment. Yeah, wrath of God. By what means are we saved or rescued from this judgment or this wrath of God? The life of Yeshua. He gives up his life. It's a redemption. It's an exchange, right? He's giving us a benefit of being righteous or justified before God, meaning not guilty, meaning standing as if we did not have any guilt. And we may actually have guilt, but that guilt is wiped away. It is forgiven. And then remember that Shaul has been writing to everyone in the previous chapters that all of us are under sin. He went for like a chapter and a half talking about how everything that Gentiles do brings them under sin. And then he turns around to Jews and says, and by the way, you also have some problems in your life. And so guess what? You also have to answer God. We're all in the same boat. I don't care, he says, if you're Jewish or not Jewish. We have a sin problem in our life. And we're going to have to come to God to solve that problem. We're going to have to approach him to get the resolution. And so this is the resolution. This is what he's saying, that we can be united in this resolution. The death of Messiah, his gift of his own life, essentially. While we may not entirely deserve it, we may be sinners, we may not be in the great place with God, he says that's love. That's a love of God showing us that kind of kindness and mercy. And so we are saved or rescued, and I know that's another one of those words that's loaded up with tons and tons of luggage that comes with it. A whole train cart full of meaning comes with the word saved. Okay? But all it means is rescued, meaning we are saved from God's wrath. God's wrath and judgment, okay, is what the scariest thing that we can possibly endure, right? And that is what we are coming out of because we literally stand in a place of favor with God. And all that is possible because of what Yeshua is doing. Yes, David?
So right here it also reminds me, like the last verses, that by his blood we shall be saved, rescued from the wrath through God, of God through him. And it brings me to Isaiah 26. And I'm just have the thoughts of the Passover lamb. Behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. So it says, verse 19 in Isaiah 26, your dead shall live, their bodies shall arise. Awake and sing, you who dwell in the dust, for your dew is like the dew of herbs, and the earth will cast out the departed spirits. Verse 20, come, my people, enter into your rooms and shut your doors behind you. Hide yourself for a little moment until the indignation is past. Verse 21, for behold, Hashem comes out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. The earth also will disclose her blood and will no longer cover her slain. So I visualize the resurrection of the dead and him putting us in the house he's preparing for us, and we putting his blood over our door and being saved from the wrath to come and hiding.
Yeah, you just took a whole bunch of metaphors from various places and put them all together, which is fine. It works. It works. It works beautifully in your mind, David. I love that. I love that you're able to pull from all these places, and some of us can definitely track with you. So it's true. I mean, this is what we're talking about. The language of redemption, the Passover. I mean, this is not new. It's not new. This is in Isaiah. It has been proclaimed many times before. And yes, it's in the Torah, because when we have redemption from slavery in Egypt, how are we redeemed? By the blood of the lamb. The lambs have to die, and then the lambs die, and all of a sudden the firstborn now don't have to die. And the firstborn get to come out of Egypt unscathed, right? So this is the same story, just repeated and told in a different way, essentially. So yes, this should be familiar to people. That should be understood. But this is Shaul's way of explaining of how we stand with God where we stand. We are rescued from judgment by standing in that favor that we receive because, while we were sinners, Messiah died for us. We may have not deserved it, but he gave it to us as a gift. We could choose to take it, or we can choose to say, I don't want that kind of gift. And some people, that's exactly where they have been. It is what it is. Take it or leave it. That's what I tell people.
About at the right time, because I've always wondered about that.
So at the right time, there are many things I could say about that. Let me just say just a couple. The timing of this happening could have only happened in that time of the first century. There are so many things about the right time. Number one, the temple is standing. It is very important for this to happen while the temple is standing. The timing is key. There are prophecies in the prophets that speak about Messiah coming and the very specific time when the temple is standing. Messiah and the temple are always connected. The timing of this happening at the right time, this is the moment when, for the first time in history, non-Jews, the Greek-speaking world, has access to Jewish scriptures because they've been translated into Greek just 150 years before that. That did not exist for thousands of years. Gentiles had no idea what it is that Jews believe or read or are inspired by. And all of a sudden, now it's available in Greek. It's like, imagine if the Bible was in Hebrew only and you could never read it. And all of a sudden, you get a hold of a translation. And you're like, wow, I can actually know what these people are mumbling about during Shabbat services for 3.5 hours. All of a sudden, it makes sense. Like, that never happened. And now all of a sudden, this has never happened before in history. People are actually opening up their minds to the idea that the God of Israel could be for them. That has never happened before. The nations have always had their gods, and never have they turned to the God of Israel and said, your God will be my God, your people will be my people, with exceptions of just a few strange individuals out there. But now this is happening by hundreds of people, thousands of people are saying that. That's what the whole book of Romans is about. There's a whole groups of people living in the city of Rome that he has to write a letter to explain all this stuff because there's so many of them. Don't want to lose them. They're important. God has brought them to himself. So Shaul is going to take the time out of his busy schedule sitting in jail to write letters like this.
Would you include in that God using empire for his purposes and that Rome had a worldwide network of roads?
Yeah. There's so many things. The network of roads. Never have people been able to travel the way they've traveled, because now you actually have roads that take you places. And Roman roads, they're like highways. They're 2-lane. There's a right lane and a left lane. You just pass each other right there. It's pretty amazing. That's never happened before. But now Alexander the Great came and he built those roads. Yes, he built them for their armies, but then the people kept using them for other needs. And now they travel alongside of the roads. You know how many things happen in the gospel stories alongside of the road? And on the road to such and such place, they met and they talked, and all of a sudden that becomes a place where these things happen. Shane? Yeah.
Let's see if I can articulate this question. So Paul, it seems like, if I recall, was taught by Messiah himself after he had the vision for a while, because he didn't learn from anybody. He makes that a statement. So his view of Messiah and how this all fulfills prophecy and everything is taught by that. But yet he was taught under Gamaliel, however you say it.
He had a good foundation. A good base.
Right. So I'm just curious, do you know of, and if you don't want to answer this question now because it's not related enough to the subject, I'm wondering, his teaching would have been so strange to other Jews who also had a foundation like that, would they be understanding? Was there a large part of the rabbinical, or a large part, of portions of the rabbinical groups that were like, hey, we can see this? I'm just so curious to why his teaching was so, for what we hear, so distinctly revolutionary, or why wouldn't it have been a little more easier for them to digest?
I hear your question. So you've been coming here for a while. You probably heard at least a portion of my series on different groups within Judaism. I call it diversity, or early Judaism. How there are different groups of Jews, always have been. Judaism has never been just, this is how Jews are. No, it's like, this is how Jews are, and this is how Jews are, and this, maybe that's not who we are. You can say, well, it's us and this is them. There are groups within groups always. So there were groups within Judaism who were thinking more along the lines of how he was thinking. And then there were groups within Judaism who were thinking way differently from the way he was thinking. And that's okay, because people realize that there's a diversity of thought and there are different opinions. And there are some groups that are more numerous and they dominate, and other groups are less numerous and they kind of have to go and have their private little time in the back room. But the reality is that this is one of the ways of explaining it. Paul, he is, as a teacher, he's not outside of the mainstream thought. In fact, after he went off, we read the book of Acts that he goes out, and out there in the wilderness, he has to have a time of downloading and processing everything that he needs to understand, because he had this revelation of Messiah. But then he goes to Jerusalem. That's the next thing that happens. And he wants to sit down with the disciples, and he says, now I'm going to submit my teaching to you. And he actually submitted his teaching to them, to the apostles, to people who walked with Yeshua, to people who sat with him for years and listened to what he taught. He says, now I want to make sure, because I wasn't there, that this is right according to the kinds of things that you heard and you understood and you were taught because you were there. So yes, he sits down with people like Yaakov, with James, right? He sits down with Kepha, he calls Peter Kepha. He's one of the few people who keeps calling him that, because in Aramaic he calls him by his Aramaic name. Everybody else calls him Peter, right? He sits down with them and he says, you guys were there, I want to hear. And I submit my understanding, my teaching. And that takes a lot of humility for a person who is way more educated than them, because they did not go to Yeshua. He did. But he sits down and says, I want to make sure I have this right. This is how I now understand it. And in the book of Acts, he writes that they have affirmed me. They said yes. And he goes to the nations and he starts teaching his teaching to the nations. He adapts a Jewish message of hope now to the nations. And that is the greatest contribution that Shaul has done. I mean, because now we have the nations of the world who've walked away from idolatry because of his teachings, because of how much of a hold these teachings have taken. And so people sometimes look down on the New Testament. I'm fascinated by it. That's because that has transformed people's lives. And that's why, I would dare take the time to study the Greek so I can understand in its context and its proper language.
And yes. I think the novelty, the pioneering that he was doing was that this message with the God of Israel was coming to the Gentiles without them, and them being approved and received by Hashem without circumcision. And that was a big thrust. How does all that happen without circumcision?
It is something that Hashem has foreseen. All the prophets of Israel speak of the time when God and his truth will be embraced by the nations. It just doesn't say how. It doesn't say through what means. It doesn't tell you how it's to happen. It just says that it will happen. And so we already have the beginnings of that happening in our lifetime. It's been happening for a long time since then. And so Shaul writes these words again. These teachings, that's what they're for. They're to explain. And to answer your question, Linda, earlier, how much do people understand? Yes, some people, and you, Shane, too, some people probably had a hard time understanding Shaul and these teachings as well, because he's venturing into some areas that, unless you really know and been revealed some of the same things, it's kind of hard to track with. And I understand why it's challenging, and I understand why people take these words and kind of rework them in every way possible. So let's look at the next few verses. Let's see if we get some more clarity here. So if while we were hostile, so he still talks about the time of us being not on the same page with God, we were reconciled to God through the death of his son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved or rescued by his life. So this is where resurrection is important. The fact that Messiah dies is not. as important as the fact that he rises. Death is important, but the resurrection is even more so, because that's what brings about salvation. That's what brings about this rescue. And so it's not only this, but we also take pride or boast, he says, in God through our Master Yeshua Messiah, through whom we have now received reconciliation. So Messiah's death leads to reconciliation. His life leads to us being rescued. Rescued from what? Judgment. Judgment, from wrath. Because wrath falls upon those who stand unrepentant in sin. For those who owe to Hashem that which cannot be repaid. Because, like I said, for some sins, there is no auto payment. You're just going to have to pay for it with your life, essentially. That's what Yeshua comes in. This is the forgiveness. This is the grace. This is the gift. This is the favor that Shaul is trying to describe. And again, he's speaking both to Jews and Gentiles. So we are reconciled, and then we are rescued. Let's keep going. Verses 12 and further. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all mankind because all sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not counted or said to one's accounted against anyone when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam until Moses, even over those who had not sinned, in the likeness of the violation committed by Adam, who is a type or pattern or model of him who was to come. Now, this is a beautiful teaching right here. This is where you realize that he's a rabbi, because he's getting midrashic on you. I mean, this is beautiful midrash. So, the penalty for human sin is death, he says. That's an important takeaway from this little section, which actually reigned in the world. He says of death reigning in the world. Now, you realize that's metaphor, because obviously death does not have a throne and a big scepter, and it's not crowned to be king of this world, but metaphorically, death reigned in this world. But Messiah corrected that reign, corrected that state of things. You have death coming into the world because of sin, because of Adam. Death has entered into our realm. We were not created to die. We were created to live forever. But it was messed up. And now, death is reigning. And Messiah comes in and corrects it. That's what he's saying. Because sin was in the world, but sin not counted to one's account against anyone where there is no law. So that statement right there gives a lot of people trouble. Again, it's a parenthetical statement, kind of like in the middle of his bigger discussion. When people start harping on that one verse alone and take it out of context, that's really when it gets out of control. But what he's trying to tell us, again, is that Adam, he is a model or a pattern of him who was to come. Who is him who was to come? The Messiah. Adam is like Messiah. So what Adam has done, okay, wrongly, Messiah is going to undo. That's what he's saying.
Is the likeness of violation Adam's disobedience compared to Yeshua's obedience? Isn't that
Yes,
the
yes.
highlight?
That's what he's going to say, yeah.
Okay.
When he talks about it, so NASB uses the word type. I don't like the word type, because now people get into typology, which is, I don't know, one of these days I'll explain why that's a problem. Pattern or model is what I prefer. Adam is like a pattern. He's like a model of something. And what Messiah is going to do is going to be like that. The reason why I'm so upset about typology is because of, again, how that was used in very anti-Semitic ways. But this is what I want you to see, that Adam and Messiah are connected. Through one man, sin enters the world. And now death reigns. And through one man, it's going to be undone or corrected. Let's put it that way. So Shaul basically is trying to explain to us the gift of grace that Messiah brought, as is the opposite of Adam's offense. That's what he tells us. In the next chapter, if we just keep reading, I'm skipping a little bit, The sin of one man brought suffering to many. That's what he talks about. The merit of a single man, Yeshua, brought favor to many. That's what he does. Look, Adam, Yeshua, right? That's verse 17 right there. This is the first brought condemnation or judgment, meaning Adam. The second brought justification or righteousness, right? This is what we're talking about. So what is he doing now? He's doing the midrash. He's doing the comparatives. This is what he wants you to see. He's painting a beautiful picture of redemption through a story that people know. Adam is where it begins. Messiah is where it culminates. So Torah was given, Shaul said, to make sin obvious. But grace or favor could be seen in that contrast even more. When you realize what sin is, you realize how good forgiveness is. But in order to understand the goodness of forgiveness, you have to realize how bad things can get, essentially. So sin reigned in death, he says. So a grace or favor would reign through righteousness to eternal life. That's Romans 5, verses 20 through 21. And so Messiah brings about what I call the divine reversal. And that is good news for Jews and Greeks and barbarians and everyone else out there. Yes?
Question. This is on top of what, it's not like he's saying this is the only reason, right? This is just another reason among all the other reasons that God gave the Torah.
Sure.
Right?
Of course. Nothing is exclusive. Never Shaul gives us an authoritative teaching on the purposes and reasons for Torah. But in his teaching, a lot of times he makes comments to his point, like whatever he's talking about in context. Sometimes he says, oh, this happened, that happened. So everything is to be understood in context. Shaul never authored a teaching on the purpose of Torah. But he did tell us that one of the reasons the Torah was given is so that sin becomes obvious in our life. And that we can agree on that. That's one reason. But there's many others, yes.
So, going back to death
Yes.
and sin, this is the separation from God, Hashem. So if we die in sin, we are separated for eternity without this forgiveness.
Right. But we don't really understand what happens on the other side, honestly. We kind of have a lot of guesses in that area.
Doesn't Isaiah say sin is the separation?
It is. Sin is separation. God and sin do not work together. But God is redemptive by his nature. So there's purification that can happen. And I don't have all the answers about the end and the afterlife and things like that. We have tiny little glimpses of that. And I could speculate a whole lot. Why? Because I've read all the speculations that are out there. But I don't want to lead you there because then we're going to get lost in a whole bunch of speculations we know about something that we're just supposed to trust God with. We know that going to living in sin is going to end up bad. And so certainly do not want to die in a state of unrepentant, blatant rebellion against God. I mean, I do not see how that's going to be good for anyone, right? We get that. Does God have remedies for that? I hope so. That's my hope. That's what I would expect the kind of God I worship to have. A solution for us of some sorts, or maybe multiples. I don't know. But that's not what this teaching is about. What teaching is, he's saying that death reigned. Death means people were dying. It's like we weren't made to die, but now all of us would die. One after another, after another, after another. Nobody's going to live forever anymore. And that was not how God designed the world. And so, we're living in a world that's malfunctioning, let's put it that way, in many, many different ways. And we try to make the best sense of it, but it doesn't always work because you and I actually do not know the world that functions the way it should. We only know the broken version. We're trying to reconstruct it the best way we can, but it doesn't always work. Yes?
I've always heard in Judaism there's no real concept of eternal separation from God after dying. There's a concept of having to go through a process of purification of the soul, but ultimately at the end of the day, all souls find their way back to Hashem. There's no concept of eternity in hell, essentially, in Judaism. So I think that's important to say.
In Judaism, since medieval times, let's clarify that statement. Since medieval times, in Judaism, there is no such thing. Prior to medieval times, oh yes, there is. And there are different, remember, there's no such thing as the Judaism as well. Remember, there are many different types of Judaisms that all have competing thoughts about afterlife. Didn't I just say that we don't really get it and we don't really know, that we think we know, and we try to make the best of reconstructing these things, but there are many secrets that have not been opened to us. So, I mean, that's the only correction I would say. So yes, you're correct, but that idea, the way it is accepted today, de facto, really does not go into antiquity. It only goes about as far as medieval times. It may have some people might have believed it earlier on, but as the further back you go, the more you'll discover that doesn't stand up. Yeah.
Well, we're not there yet, but as we get there to answer that, I think Romans 8, the end of Romans 8 answers that. Paul, the Pharisee, not the Sadducee, who believes in resurrection of the dead and the afterlife, and he's persuaded that death cannot separate us from the love of
Right.
God that is in Messiah Yeshua.
Right.
And what is the love of God that is in Messiah Yeshua if it isn't salvation?
Right. So be open-minded. My goal is in saying this, just be open-minded about this idea. Entertain it. Entertain both sides for a little while. You know, just think about it in a much, much big picture. Yes, Ms. Beth?
It's a continuum, like when Adam failed, and God knew right then, okay, he failed. We're meant to be living forever. We're meant to be holy with him. That's not going to happen. So he started a process, and it took a while. He had to take a person, he had to take a family, he had to take a people, he had to take a people and teach them who they were and give them identity and a government, and he had to teach them what sin was, he had to teach them how to deal with it. And then he brought the Messiah, like he always promised. Yeshua is a Jewish Messiah. Don't take him from us. He's
Yes.
our Messiah. God gave him to us first and then to all. But he, you'll stop. Like, we got the Torah, we got all these things, we got an identity, and then Messiah came to do for us what that was not enough. It's just not enough to stop there. That's why he did this. It's necessary.
There's a redemption of the world that is yet to come.
Yeah.
That
That's what
we are yet to see. And so you and I are witnessing the first fruits of the redemption of the world, which again is the work of the Messiah, but it's going to have to happen. So this is what we mean when I say divine reversal. This is what I mean. The divine reversal begins going back to the way things, eventually we will get back to the way things were in Gan Eden. When that happens, you know, I don't know, but we're not quite there yet, right? We are in that moment of divine reversal. Let me wrap this up because our time is running away from us. So, Adam, Messiah, death and favor. Shaul explained the good news, the divine reversal, through this midrashic language of analogy, the language of symbols and patterns that is actually common to Jewish thought. This was a very Jewish explanation. That's the way he did it. What I want you to realize that those unaccustomed to such language can walk away with actually wrong ideas, reading the same very verses that I just read for you. Here's the idea they walk away with. If divine favor is magnified with sin, maybe sin is not so bad. See, the next chapter is going to be to address somebody who might think that way. Because if grace, if God's favor is so beautiful and wonderful, and the only way for me to really see it is to sin really, really bad, then maybe I should just stay the way I'm. He's going to address the entire chapter, that logic, because apparently some people went that way. Exactly. That's how he begins that chapter, so you understand it. So anyway, I wanted to get us to that point because that segues into what comes next. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your time and attention. As usual, great discussion, awesome questions. Keep it coming. Next time.